Protestantism has a pretty serious problem, and I think Protestants are starting to recognize that because the non-denominational, evangelical, more modern branches of Protestantism have become too modern, and a lot of men, especially in those denominations, want something more traditional. However, the more traditional branches of Protestantism have been overcome by woke ideology. This is what we see in the largest branch of Lutheranism, the ELCA. This is what we see in Presbyterianism, in Methodism, and these like externally more traditional branches of Protestantism are also very woke. And so men are left with a conundrum. What do I do? And that's why a lot of them are coming to Catholicism and going to Eastern Orthodoxy. But some are staying in Protestantism and trying to fight the good fight and try to reform Protestantism to be more traditional while also remaining theologically based, so to speak. And one of the guys who is doing this is, like I said, Dylan Baker over at the Protestant Gentleman. I promise I didn't pause on this to make him look silly or something. This is just where the video paused. But he did an interview with Tracing the Cross, and they were talking about this whole problem of, men are looking for something more traditional, and the evangelical non-denominational churches aren't providing that. So what are we to do? And he gives a bit of advice here, which I think is good advice, but I think it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense under a Protestant ecclesiology, let's say. So let's just hear what this is, and then I'll give my thoughts. Oh, did you guys want to hear the audio, or did you want me to mute it?
What is your advice overall to men, and really just anyone that is feeling disillusioned with their evangelical church? Do you think they should stay and try to reform their non-denominational church? Should they flee? Where should they go? What should they do? Who do they study? What is your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. My heart would be to never do an Irish goodbye. And so never separate from your church unless it's like absolutely necessary, unless you've gone through all the precautions. If you are in a good Bible preaching church that the pastors are on the same page and you have open dialogue with them and they seem to be somewhat open to these conversations, I don't think you should ever abandon ship. And it should be a pretty hard process. It shouldn't be like, I don't agree anymore, I'm out. Yeah. That's not the way you should go about it. And so I don't want to promote that whatsoever. How I would prefer this to take place is that these non-denominational church either cultivate to make somewhat of a denomination. I know the SBC, a lot of these churches are loosely tied to the SBC, and try to say that they're a non-denominational denomination. They're loosely tied. I don't think that does anyone any favors. It's like saying you're married but not really married. Like we're
okay, we get it. So the message here is don't leave your church willy-nilly. Just try to make some change in your church before you leave it. Don't just up and leave. I think that's good advice. I just wish that they would apply that advice to Martin Luther. Now I know what they would say. They would say, well, Martin Luther was kicked out of the church. He was excommunicated by the Pope, and so he didn't have a choice. But it doesn't mean that everybody should have followed Martin Luther out of the church just because he was kicked out. They could have pushed for some of the changes that he was pushing for while still remaining in the church. And, there have been a lot of reformers in the Catholic Church who made a lot of change within the church and who, pushed people's buttons, who upset the hierarchy because of what the change they were trying to make in the church. We have St. Francis of Assisi, who established the Franciscan order, and he's known as a reformer of the church. We have during the Counter-Reformation, we have St. Charles Borromeo, is it, who establishes a lot of great change in the church, and all of this is done while staying in the one true Catholic Church. So it doesn't have to be this thing where, Martin Luther left the church, and then Zwingli left Luther's thing, and then Calvin did his thing, and then, now we have all these different things. But now that you're in this one local church, you should just stay there, even though it sucks, and try to change it from the inside. Well, why now? That's what I don't understand. Why do we have to now stay in these, modernized evangelical or non-denominational churches? Why couldn't you apply that to like 500 years ago when like, hey, I know there's some problems in the Catholic Church. And by the way, there were some problems in the Catholic Church, and there are some problems in the Catholic Church today. But you don't fix that by leaving the church. And in fact, by leaving the church, you put in jeopardy your own eternal destination, which is why you shouldn't, especially why you shouldn't leave the church, because salvation is in the Catholic Church, and to leave it, even if you have good valid complaints about it, leaving it is not an option. So yeah, and another big problem with this way of thinking is that it just doesn't make sense in Protestant ecclesiology, because if, let's say, you're at your local church, you start to not like maybe some of the liturgical changes or some of the preaching, whatever. You don't like that they're serving coffee during church services or something. Why not just leave? What would be the negative there, other than, okay, you're letting this church kind of just change? Uh, why not just leave? Why not just go to a different church that you like more, that you feel better at? If in Protestantism you acknowledge that, well, my evangelical church, we're all saved, but also that non-denominational church down the street that does things very different from us, they're all saved. But also that Lutheran church, they're all saved. But also that Presbyterian church, they're all saved. Why not just find the church that you like the most if you're going to be saved anyways? There's no spiritual consequence to leaving. So I think that this is kind of an uphill battle. I I recognize that, like, it's good what these guys are trying to do, what Redeemed Zoomer is trying to do in reclaiming the establishment, Protestant churches, taking them back from the woke people. But ultimately, it's an uphill battle, and I don't think it's ultimately going to end up the way that they hope it is, and the way that I hope it would. I would hope that it would end up the way that Redeemed Zoomer wants it to end up. But the reality is, let's say Redeemed Zoomer or Dylan Baker, Protestant gentleman, let's say they reform their little corner of Protestantism. Okay, well, a lot of people in those churches aren't going to like those reforms, so they're going to leave and go find another church that agrees with them. And even if you are to make your own little corner of Protestantism super based in trad, the rest of Protestantism is still going to be the way it is. So you're really fixing your local church, that is the only thing you can really impact. And that's true of Catholicism as well. You can only really impact your local parish. But being that Catholicism, that the Catholic Church is a global entity, if you make changes in the Catholic Church, that can have broad-reaching implications. But if you fix your local Protestant church, that's what you fixed, your local Protestant church. There's still going to be the majority of Protestantism out there that is off the rails. So I think the real solution is to just rejoin the Catholic Church, guys, and fix the Catholic Church. If you think that there are problems in the Catholic Church, and by the way, there are problems in the Catholic Church, not foundational problems, not things that invalidate its truth claims, but there are problems in the Catholic Church. There's lack of good catechesis. That's one of the things that Martin Luther brought up actually during his Reformation or his rebellion. If you read the Luther's catechisms, which I've read the small and large catechism, he talks about how he's writing this because the catechesis of Catholics is really bad, and so he wants to catechize people well. That's a noble effort, and I still think we have a problem with poor catechesis in Catholicism. So there's a problem that we can fix. You can start a YouTube channel like this. You can go to your local parish and try to help them with catechesis. They always need volunteers. But you can't fix the Catholic Church by being outside of the Catholic Church. That's just not going to happen. And I left a comment to this effect under this video. Let me, again, the formatting is the best part of the show. So I said, I love this conversation, but I can't help but feel this is an uphill battle that is ultimately unnecessary. Even if you fix your denomination, or if Redeemed Zoomer fixes Presbyterianism, that is only going to be your small corner of Christianity that is fixed. Even in the best case, Redeemed Zoomer will fix PCUSA, but there will still be Presbyterian denominations that are off the rails, and still the rest of Protestantism would be fractured and off track. I don't think this is a problem for one or a few denominations. I think it's a problem with the underlying ecclesiology of Protestantism. The idea that you can just separate from the Catholic Church and have a loose network of churches in the same denomination, but without any authority or with very little authority at the top, is completely novel and will always lead to new denominations springing up. The reason this is inevitable is because the precedent has been set that you can separate from the visible church without any spiritual consequences. So why can't you do that again and again and again? Dylan said you shouldn't leave your church too hastily, but why not? What would be the consequence of that? A longer commute? I truly believe that Protestants and the Catholic Church will benefit beyond our imaginations once we reunite. It's the only way. Yeah, I think like the idea that you can leave the visible church and still be saved and not have any spiritual consequences, that is at the root of Protestant ecclesiology. And that means that it can never be fully reformed because people will just break off and find their own version of Christianity that they like more than what you've reformed their church to be.